I'm going to go ahead and apologize real quick. The audio is going to be a bit shitty today because I recorded my video on my phone and now it's not wanting to upload to my computer or to Google Drive. So I'm doing the best I can for today. Tomorrow I'm going to actually start using my camera, and that should make things much simpler. Alright, let's get started. Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Icarus, and today we are going over Chapter 6 of The Whipping Girl. Also, side note, I have a tripod now, so I can use my camera. I'm not using it today, but I will be using it in the future. So yeah, I'm very excited. My usual disclaimers apply. This book was published in 2007, written in 2005. There are going to be many terms that are considered outdated by today's standards because this is 15 years in the future. I am doing my best to come at this from a non-biased perspective. However, if you have seen my other videos, I am heavily disagreeing with Serrano on so many things, and I feel she is actively excluding trans men and non-binary perspectives while trying to say her perspective as a singular trans woman is something that can be pushed across the greater narrative. I also find her to be a little bit NB-phobic and a little transandrophobic because she insists that trans women have it worse out of all of the sexes, as she calls them. However, like I said, I'm doing my best to come to each chapter after I've mentally recovered from the last one, kind of wipe the slate clean, that sort of thing. However, today we'll be going over this a little differently because my end of the chapter notes make a lot more sense if we just come to them as I'm reading the text. So, without further ado, Chapter 6, Intrinsic Inclinations, Explaining Gender and Sexual Diversity. And this is going to be a fun one because I did double check, and she was a geneticist for about 17 years. She studied genes and developmental history, that sort of thing. So she's not coming into this as some layman, where I kind of am. I did study biology and that sort of thing in college and high school, but by no means did I get a PhD. So, well, you got to keep that in mind when I'm discussing this sort of thing. In her first paragraph, she's just talking about how she is sort of minimizing gender expression, and it's actually much more complicated that she puts throughout the chapter. That would have been great to put into the chapter, not as a footnote, but it's already published, I can't help it. So the next paragraph is, gender expression is regularly confused with subconscious sex and or sexual orientation. For example, people often assume that transsexuals transition not to align our physical and subconscious sexes, but because we want to express either femininity or masculinity. Similarly, it is common for some people to be mistaken for being lesbian or gay, simply because they are somewhat masculine as women go, or feminine as men go, respectively. Unlike our sexual orientation and subconscious sex, which are usually invisible to the rest of the world, other people can readily view our gender expression, making it perhaps the most widely commented on, critiqued, and regulated aspect of gender. So, I don't fully disagree with this. I do think there is a lot of phobia around how one expresses their gender identity. You can see that a lot with, say, heterosexual men who may have been raised primarily by a female figure in their life, so they end up adopting a lot of what's generally considered feminine mannerisms. And those feminine mannerisms often get associated with gay men, so then they are considered gay and they could be teased in school or discriminated against or harassed, assaulted, that sort of thing, even though the reason they speak like this, that, etc., etc. You also can see this most readily in, say, a white person adopting black mannerisms because they grew up in the ghetto or in other marginalized parts of their town. So they will be able to speak AAVE, or they may have a sort of subconscious permission to use the language because they are raised there. But the moment they step out into the greater bubble, it becomes harder to understand, like connect with that, realize they're coming from this way. You just see a white person appropriating black language, that sort of thing. So I do agree with this. I mildly disagree with, at least in modernity, people assuming transsexual people just want to express femininity or masculinity because it is slowly becoming more accepted to have gender nonconforming women and men. However, there is still a lot of harassment that you get, say, from butch women getting assaulted in bathrooms because someone assumed they were a trans woman, and that is a huge problem. It's also one of the reasons why I have issues with the TME, TMA, trans misogyny, exempt trans misogyny affected, because in that moment, that gender nonconforming woman who someone saw as a trans woman or a man in a dress, she gets assaulted, she's usually considered TME, but in that moment, she's TMA. So you see the problem with the language. Anyway, she goes on to talk about how gender expression is super regulated because things need to be in opposites. Then talking a little bit about social construct versus gender essentialism and explaining both sides, where social constructionists believe that gender and gender expression are entirely created through society and socialization, and gender essentialists say, no, it's hardwired into our DNA. And she says, as someone who is both a geneticist and has experienced firsthand the very different ways in which women and men are treated and valued in our society, I believe that both social constructionists and gender essentialists are wrong, or at least they are both only partially right. She then goes into the fact that gender essentialism kind of ignores the way that gender can be expressed through a spectrum because they're very stuck in the binary. And then she also mentions, unfortunately, a strict social constructionist model does not easily account for exceptional gender expression either. Exceptional in this case meaning not within the norm, not a, oh, you're an exceptional person, but, oh, you are an exception to the norm. So it's her way of trying not to call trans or gender nonconforming people abnormal. Many girls who are masculine and boys who are feminine show signs of such behavior at a very age, often before such children have been fully socialized with regard to gender norms, and generally continue to express such behavior into adulthood, despite the extreme amount of societal pressure that we place on individuals to reproduce gender expression appropriate for their assigned sex. And I find myself pausing at that, and well, on the one hand, I get where she's coming from. I do believe that we have evolved from a point where these social expectations were needed just to survive. The idea of the males in our early naked egg days were typically stronger and more masculine, so it made sense for them to go out, and the more feminine naked apes would be the ones that would stay and nurture and caretake and that sort of thing. And those that survived ended up multiplying, passing on those genes, and there was some sort of gene expression there where it got carried forth, and then society comes in and they start regimenting that. However, we also have seen a lot of signs where people will argue, and I want to go into this from a different angle. People have argued that humans inherently are selfish and they don't try to take care of each other. But we have seen historically there have been our ancestors taking care of the disabled, the elderly. We don't just kick them out of the cave because they can't help hunt. We are inherently social creatures, and even though there are some exceptional people, using her words, that aren't quite as social as, say, you or me, we are, as a species, meant to work together. This inherent selfishness that people say is innate, is part of our gender, or part of our DNA, it's just not true. And this idea that you can't be socialized from infancy is also not true. We have studies showing that very, very young infants will cry with an accent. So a Taiwanese baby will cry and a Russian baby will cry, and they won't understand each other because they're crying in different languages. So while I do think there may be some truth to the idea that somewhere along the way, deep in our DNA and our reptile monkey brains, there was some sort of socialization gender aspect that got passed along, I also think we're past the need for it, and we can never separate how much of our gender identity is because of socialization, because we get exposed to stuff from the moment we're born. If we could create a test world and make it so that like two babies, biologically male, biologically female baby, grow up without anything from our society affecting them, then maybe we'd have a case. But we don't have that. It is literally impossible. Plus, we have evolved to the point where our bodies were evolved to live to a certain point, just long enough so we could procreate and make sure our offspring survives. That's why we start breaking down at like 30, 40 years old. We were not selected past that point. We just needed to give birth, procreate, move on. But we're still here. We have started working through artificial evolution, technology, prosthetics, that sort of thing, to ease our lives. So what does it matter if there is some innate, deep down gender expression thing going in your brain, because it's as residual as the tailbone, honestly. Our coccyx doesn't serve very much purpose at all, but it's still there. It shows that we had tails. Okay, so I'm gonna move on before I say anything really dumb and show that I am not reading from a script. This is all right off the top of my dome. So we have stuff like she's talking about how gender inclinations are in animals. I'm just like, we are very different from animals. And though we do have very similarities to animals, we are also evolved past the point, because there's not very many animals that can actually use tools in the way we can. We have seen some COVID and some monkeys be able to use sort of strategic thinking. Like, if you, probably very common post, but the crow or raven that was dropping rocks into water so it could drink, that sort of thing. However, problem solving is called problem solving. However, they're not on the same level as us. So we've kind of evolved further than. And I just highlighted a whole big thing here, so be patient. In order to reconcile this issue, being the differences between gender essentialists and social constructionists, I would like to put forward what I call an intrinsic inclination model to explain human gender and sexual variation. Here are the basic tenets of this model. Subconscious sex, gender expression, and sexual orientation represent separate gender inclinations that are determined largely independently of one another. This model does not preclude the possibility that these three inclinations may themselves be composed of multiple separable inclinations, or that additional inclinations may exist as well. Brief pause. I still have issues with the subconscious sex simply from the moment that she mentioned non-binary people only partially expressing their subconscious sex. So she cannot hold my attention, and I can't give her any validity simply from that, but we'll keep reading. These gender inclinations are, to some extent, intrinsic to our persons, as they occur on a deep subconscious level and generally remain intact despite social influences and conscious attempts by individuals to purge, repress, or ignore them. Once again, we're hitting the I don't know if I can agree or not. I do think one's innate gender is something that can't be so easily swayed by external forces, but babies start crying with an accent at a very young age. We don't know what they take in from the outside world, but we know they take something. Because no single genetic, anatomical, hormonal, environmental, or psychological factor has ever been found to directly cause any of these gender inclinations, we can assume that they are quantitative traits. Basically, like how height isn't dependent on a single gene expression, it's actually multiple gene expressions piled on top of each other. So if you're short like me, I didn't get enough kids in the trench coat to be tall, whereas my dad and my sister, they have very many kids in the trench coat. As a result, rather than producing discrete classes such as feminine and masculine, attraction to women or men, each inclination shows a continuous range of possible outcomes. So why you can have so many differing heights in humans. Each of these inclinations roughly correlates with physical sex, resulting in a bimodal distribution pattern, i.e. two overlapping bell curves. So that's the thing you'll see where there are two loops, and in the middle there's kind of a dip. Resulting in a bimodal distribution pattern similar to that seen for other gender differences, such as height. While it may be true that, on average, men are taller than women, such a statement becomes virtually meaningless when one examines individual people, as any given woman may be taller than any given man. Most people have heights that are relatively close to the average, but others fall in outlying areas of the range. For instance, some women are 6 feet 2 inches, and some men are 5 feet 4 inches. I am feeling called out. Similarly, while women on average are more feminine than men, some women are more masculine than certain men, and some men are more feminine than certain women. Because these inclinations appear to have multiple inputs and show a continuous range of outcomes, it is incorrect to assume that those with exceptional sexual orientations, subconscious sexes, or gender expressions represent developmental, biological, or environmental errors. Rather, they are naturally occurring examples of human variation. So that is her idea of how gender expression and identity and sexual orientation come in. I find it a little confusing sometimes because she talks about being a trans woman almost as a sexual orientation many times. And other times she makes it very clear that they're not meant to be overlapped. But, you know, I may just be me reading something wrong. I also agree that exceptional gender expressions and sexual orientations aren't an error because you do have in nature plenty of examples of other creatures with their baser instincts showing homosexual tendencies, and there are animals that do have third genders and that sort of thing. I used to remember when I would look at the Human comics, human with an O, and going through different like birds and that sort of thing. That was always really cool. Another very early example of me reading about non-traditional gender standards, even though these were just like birds and lizards and stuff humanified, before I knew what transgender was. Geez, everything was beating me in the face and I just did not recognize it. So this chapter was in two sections. The second section is titled Reconciling Intrinsic Inclinations with Social Constructs. And we are going to scroll down a bit. In our society, what it means to be a woman or a man, the symbols, customs, expectations, restrictions, and privileges associated with those classes are very different today than they were 50 years ago. This holds true for both typical and exceptional gender inclinations. For example, in this time and place, I am able to identify as a woman, a dyke, a transsexual, and a transgender person. To me, each of these identities represents a slightly different but somewhat overlapping aspect of my gender and sexuality. I highlighted this because she then goes on to talk about how half a century earlier, she probably wouldn't be able to recognize herself as her current identities. And it's just important to me because you see this, and I'm once again reminded about how lesbian used to encompass a lot more than just women loving women. It included bisexual women, trans men, all sorts of things that then as we moved on and it became more important to have individualized discussions, we started having these breakdowns of like, we might have considered bisexuality a micro label if we were online 50 years ago discussing bisexuality and if it is or isn't a valid thing. I mean, we still are kind of arguing that it's a valid thing, which is tragic and depressing, but that's not part of the conversation. I just thought it was interesting to note that she sees that too. And moving on down, there's a mention about how we identify people by their gender expression, both kids from how they look, adults from secondary gender expression, so like boobs, facial hair, that sort of thing. The fact that we perceive two major categories of gender enables us to view women and men as opposites, a premise that is founded on a series of egregiously incorrect assumptions. First, in order for the two sexes to be opposites, they must first be mutually exclusive. Therefore, on a societal level, we purposefully ignore the variation that exists in sex characteristics and create the illusion that there is absolutely no overlap between the physical sexes. TERFs are really good at that. Second, we ignore the reality that intrinsic inclinations produce a continuous range of possibilities and instead assume that each inclination produces only one of two possible outcomes, mirroring the two sexes. Thus, we assume that people can only be attracted to women or men, not both, that they can only be feminine or masculine, not both, and they can only identify as female or male, not both. The third assumption we make is to presume that typical inclination for each sex holds true for all people of that sex. Thus, all female-bodied people are assumed to be feminine, to be attracted to men, and to identify as female, and vice versa for male-bodied people. I don't agree with that. The oppositional sexism that she ends up defining, I do find to be useful in a limited context. It ceases being useful the moment you start bringing non-binary or gender non-conforming identities into it, in my opinion. But it's a great way to discuss how people who don't believe in bisexuality, asexuality, that sort of thing, it's a great way to explain their viewpoint in a little more of a concise way, in my opinion. Moving down, so there's more stuff about she goes a little too into the wanting to describe the oppositional viewpoints of gender, where she's like, women are supposed to be feminine, weak, crying, men are supposed to be aggressive, no emotions, but it's over and over again, so I'm trying to skip past some of that. It feels a little bit like word padding, and then you just see the word sissy, and it's like, what? What's happening? Going to the next paragraph, of many opponents of this view of gender, binary gender, refer to it as the binary gender system, which implies that its problematic nature stems primarily from the fact that it consists of only two classes, male and female. Personally, I do not think there is necessarily any harm in us in recognizing that there are two major categories of sex, so long as we realize that these categories are neither discrete nor mutually exclusive, and that we remain respectful of the fact that many people have exceptional sex characteristics and gender inclinations. In fact, as a trans person, having spent most of my life battling gender dissonance, I don't have the privilege that others have of being able to presume that the femaleness or maleness of my body or mind is entirely meaningless, superficial, or unimportant. I have found that my physical sex and how it relates to my subconscious sex is inconsumably important to me. Once again, she is putting her own experience and assuming it across the board. And in this case, I am having a problem with her because she's like, no, there's no problem with there being two binary classes of gender so long as we're respectful of the people that fall into the boxes. And it's like, why do we need the boxes at all? You are allowed to want to express femininity and take on femininity as you define your own femininity and see yourself as a woman, but it doesn't have to be a box. And as someone who very nearly falls neatly into the masculine box, or at least I want to, I still find myself tripping over the lid because I don't fully want to be in it. So why do we need the boxes? Why can't people just be people? Then just definition of oppositional sexism, and most going down to talking about how people with exceptional gender and sexual orientations try to counteract the typical discussions that we face from homophobes and transphobes. So, I'll read it. Unfortunately, one of the most common ways people with exceptional gender and sexual traits try to counter such discrimination is by neutralizing the significance of their particular exceptional traits while simultaneously emphasizing the ways in which they otherwise uphold oppositional sexist ideals. For example, many people who are attracted to members of their own sex have tried to convince the predominantly straight mainstream public that we're just like you except for our sexual orientation. This, of course, plays down the reality that many people who identify as bisexual, gay, or lesbian also have exceptional gender expressions, sex characteristics, and/or subconscious sexes. The easiest way to understand her point that she's making here is when white men then choose to turn around and discredit everybody else because these particular white gay men were able to assimilate into the greater societal norms, or the way, like, say, white lesbians will look down upon anybody like a bisexual woman or anyone who isn't a gold star lesbian and completely ignores like every non-white perspective out there. So that's the easiest way to see it, at least in today's standards. Again, this was published before gay marriage was even legalized, and it's important to note that while gay marriage was a very important milestone in LGBT queer acceptance, it wasn't something that everybody necessarily wanted. And now that we are given the opportunity to assimilate into the norm a bit more, so to speak, people assume that the fight is over. We don't have to do anything. And for a lot of queer people who want to just kind of disappear and not seen differently, that was their fight. That's all they needed. And it's a little upsetting because you do have people that don't fall within the boxes that Serrano so badly wants to keep. At the same time, many people in the transgender community have tried to neutralize their exceptional gender traits by stressing their heterosexuality. Some transsexuals insist that their goal is to become normal women or men, i.e. straight with appropriate gender expression, and male cross-dressers often emphasize the fact that they identify as men and are attracted to women, i.e. normal subconscious sex and sexual orientation. This paragraph bothers me. There is nothing wrong with a trans person wanting to emphasize the fact that they are just whatever they are and they want to go stealth. Like, there is so much trouble as being an out and proud trans person that not everyone needs to deal with it. Not everyone wants to deal with it. They just want to be seen as a dude who likes women who just can't happen to get their girlfriend pregnant. And there's nothing wrong with that. I really take exception to her clear distaste for it, as well as her apparent distaste for straight male cross-dressers. Like, those men are very much necessary to allowing other people who may be closeted queer people to explore their identity, or they may be the first line to allow normal society to see that gender isn't necessarily black and white. So yeah, I hate that. We are all often lumped together as queer, exceptions that challenge the mainstream oppositional assumptions about gender. True. In my experience as a trans activist, I have found that the biggest obstacle facing those who fall under the queer umbrella with regards to coming together to challenge oppositional sexism is primarily a conceptual one. Over the years, different queer subgroups have developed their own theories and language to describe and communicate their particular struggles. Many of these concepts, while effective in single inclination activism, are counterproductive in the fight against oppositional sexism because they marginalize and make invisible the experiences of other queers. Looking at you, trans women who want to say trans men have all the privilege in the world, just going to use Serrano's own words against you here, and against her as well. For example, the gay rights movement has historically framed much of their activism around the premise that heterosexuals oppress homosexuals. or in my case, that cisgenders oppress transgenders. This oversimplification creates the false impression that homosexual and heterosexual people are opposites, an idea that marginalizes bisexuals, or bigender or genderqueer people. Further, the terms most commonly used to describe the prejudice faced by lesbians and gay men, homophobia and heterosexism, transphobia, and cissexism, mistakenly imply that queer people are primarily discriminated against because of their sexual orientation. This privileging of sexual orientation over gender inclinations has allowed some gay rights activists to exclude gender-variant people from their movement under the premise that they are focused on sexual orientation, not gender identity or expression, while simultaneously claiming that the prejudice and violence faced by trans people is the result of homophobia. Skipping down a little, the transgender movement, which has primarily made up of those excluded by mainstream gay rights groups, has conceptual and linguistics problems of its own. The fact that at least two overlapping classes of people, those with exceptional gender expressions and those with exceptional subconscious sexes, have been subsumed by the category transgender, has created a lot of unnecessary tension and confusion. The result is that at least two different and largely incompatible views of gender have gained hold in this community. The first one, which is forwarded by many transsexuals, can be summed up by the popular phrase, sex is in the body and gender is in the mind. While this saying is useful to convey why a transsexual might want to change their physical sex to match their identified sex, it oversimplifies the concept of gender. The fact that the word gender is shorthand for subconscious sex inadvertently privileges subconscious sex over gender expression. Further, it mistakenly implies that more socially influenced aspects of gender, such as gender identity and gender roles, as well as one's ability or willingness to conform to oppositional sexist ideals, stem directly from one's subconscious sex, which is most certainly not true. People who espouse this view often look down on those people who identify outside the male-female binary or who express combinations of masculinity and femininity, presuming that these groups do not represent serious or true transgender people. Really, the last couple sentences in that confuses me, as she herself has stated quite clearly that non-binary people are only partially expressing their subconscious sex, as she puts it. A different view is held by those transgender people who insist that gender itself is entirely constructed. Many feel empowered by this idea because it frees their exceptional gender traits from the social stigma inherent in oppositional sexism, which is a good thing in my opinion. But it also oversimplifies the concept of gender by dismissing the possibility that there are any intrinsic inclinations, such as subconscious sex and gender expression, that contribute to our gender identities and gender roles, respectively. This sort of thinking, when taken to the extreme, can privilege those people who are predisposed toward being bigendered and bisexual, in which I almost wanted to shut the book, because it's like, oh. Because then she kind of just keeps going on that for a bit, where she says, from this bisexist perspective, people who identify exclusively as either female or male, feminine or masculine, homosexual or heterosexual, are assumed to have developed such preferences as the result of being duped by the binary gender norms and socialization. This view has also led to the creation of another oppositional binary of sorts, pitting those transgender people who identify outside the gender binary, and who are therefore presumed to challenge gender norms, against transsexuals who are accused of supporting the gender status quo by transitioning to their identified sex. Such arguments that bigendered and genderqueer people are more radical or queer than transsexuals are highly reminiscent of similar naive accusations made in the past by homosexuals who argued that they were more radical or queer than bisexuals. This is biphobic bullshit. This is bigender-phobic. This is... Yes, there are some people who argue because they identify outside of the gender norms that they are more radical than binary trans people. But the mass majority of what I've seen, by far the overwhelming support that people have for binary trans people and for binary trans people who would like to go stealth Serrano and not be outed every possible second, that you have a distaste for as I yell at my laptop. only ever seen a vocal majority support for those sorts of people. There is definitely a pushback from non-binary genderqueer identities who don't want to fit into the masc-fem role. And it's understandable because they get talked over so much. Like how trans men get talked over by trans women all the time. We talk over them. We talk over intersex people. We don't give them the platform to talk. It's that meme where you have one person getting played with another person's drowning, and then you have the skeleton at the bottom of the sea who's just dead. That's non-binary and intersex people. And I find it extremely biphobic that this is included and is made out to actually be a problem when it's not. If anything, there's still a pushback against bisexual people and bi-gendered people and other genders, and it's even weirder because I didn't touch on this, it's not in my place to, but she does briefly mention other cultures where third genders or two genders and that sort of thing are more accepted and are part of the cultural landscape of those cultures. And like I said, I skipped over because I don't want to get into it. I don't want to look like an idiot. I may one day talk more about these other cultures and other cultural ideas of gender, but it would still be coming from a very white perspective, and that's important to note. This book is also from a very white perspective, and that's why I didn't want to touch it. She says, I take issue with any theory that suggests that people who are so easily duped into leading such contrived sexual and gendered lives as my own exceptional gender inclinations have been too strong and persistent to be ignored or reshaped by society. And it's like, congratulations for you. We're not saying you were duped. We are saying, cool, how about you enjoy calling yourself what you want, but we destroy the boxes so people don't feel like they have to fit into a box. Because if we don't have any boxes, we're not trying to straddle them. We're trying to just exist and be happy. That's pretty much it for the chapter. I'm going to end it here with just one last sentence from her that I feel is very important for Serrano herself to remember, as well as everyone else when we talk about gender and orientation and belittling people who we perceive to be our enemies when really, when we project our own gender-based assumptions and opinions onto other people's behaviors and bodies, we necessarily erase the distinctiveness of their individual genders and sexualities. So, yeah, I'll talk to you later. See you tomorrow.